He is just a brilliant legal mind and somehow able to take this complex area of American life, the law, and boil it down so it's understandable. It's a great pleasure to have him with us, the former federal prosecutor, now defense attorney, David Katz.
Great to be with you.
Hello, sir.
Great to be
Well,
with
there's a
you.
lot going on, and our chat was buzzing about this Kavanaugh thing. Maybe you have a thought on it. You know, Kavanaugh, during his confirmation hearing, there was this extremely controversial witness that came forward and said, you know, basically she was the victim of a sexual assault at the hands of Brett Kavanaugh. There seemed to be corroborative evidence in the sense that, as I recall, she contemporaneously related certain details to a friend. There was enough there that it didn't seem as though it was just some kind of hit job. And the word was, and remember, this is the Trump administration, well, we're going to the FBI investigate it, and the FBI, we're going to track down every lead, and other the tip line at the FBI and associated with this Brett Kavanaugh thing was lit up with all of these tips, and we're going to track down every one of them. And believe me, we're going to thoroughly investigate this situation with Kavanaugh. Well, apparently that didn't happen. I think at the time we sort of knew that it was being fast-tracked, didn't we, David Katz? But now Sheldon Whitehouse, who's just brilliant on court stuff and on dark money, he really laid it bare.
Well, this is terrific that Senator Whitehouse has gotten to the bottom of this and that they didn't just sort of let this go. This was extremely controversial. I think this is what people suspected at the time. Can I just answer you with a little bit of context? Because first, Merrick Garland, of course, famously doesn't even get a confirmation hearing. Then Gorsuch comes along, and Gorsuch basically gets his seat that should have gone to Merrick Garland. He would have been a consensus choice. If he'd have been brought up in the Senate, he would have been confirmed. There would have been no seat for Gorsuch. But now we're into the next pick. And this next pick is around fall 2018. And just to remind people, at that time, Trump had everything. He had a Republican Senate, he had a Republican House, and he was picking Republican judges for the courts. And he just picked Gorsuch. And now here comes Kavanaugh. And it's clear that with Kavanaugh, even with RBG still on the court, that they're going to have a huge majority. They're going to have a real working majority of the Republicans. So there's a huge thing whether the Republicans are going to get him or not. The Senate election is coming up that fall, and if the Senate goes Republican, they're not going to get, it was thought, nominees through like Gorsuch or Kavanaugh. So the Republicans were really worried if Kavanaugh was the right guy, if maybe they should pull back Kavanaugh and put up somebody else. So it all takes place in that context. And that's also the time mark when I was on Laura Ingraham. You might wonder, why would Laura Ingraham want to have a fair and balanced presentation with someone like me? But she was really concerned whether they were doing the right thing with Kavanaugh. So she really wanted kind of both sides of the story. Should they stick with Kavanaugh or not? And in the middle of that, of course, there are these, not in the middle of that, the main thing that has sprung that to life, that's made that lively, whether Kavanaugh is going to get through or not. And he was a very controversial person. Remember, he'd been part of the Ken Starr team. He was supposedly the one who had green lighted putting into the report the incident about President Clinton, Monica, and the cigar. That was considered very tabloid-like. Why would a person do that? And it was looking like Kavanaugh was the person who thought that was a great idea to do that. And he was a very controversial right-wing figure. The country had a pretty good idea who they were getting. And then, of course, there's this Dr. Ford who shows up in the Bay Area, and she relates, it's got to be 25 years or more, but still she relates an incident as teenagers. And she says that not only did this incident occur, but there's a third witness. She says, it's not just my word against Kavanaugh. There's this fellow named Judge who's a witness to all of that. So now they're doing this background investigation on Kavanaugh. The FBI says it's not a full federal criminal investigation, which we control. It is simply a background investigation. And therefore, we, the FBI, cannot expand our investigation and really go find somebody like Judge and interrogate him, or go find other people who are calling the tip line. Mark, we're stuck with just the scope of the investigation that we're given. And the scope of the investigation, according to Trump, was broad, look anywhere, and that was a lie. And not only was that a lie by Trump, but it was seconded and endorsed by all of these Republicans who wanted to see Kavanaugh somehow clear this hurdle. They knew it was going to be 51 or 52 votes, the most that they could get. But if they could get every Republican to hold firm, they'd be in good shape. And what's interesting, with a female witness and someone who now had a PhD and was an obviously reputable person, Dr. Ford, they needed Susan Collins's vote. They needed this Republican from Maine, right? And she said, you know, I looked in his eyes. He came to my office. Kavanaugh's okay. He's going to uphold precedent, which of course he didn't. He was the fifth vote along with Roberts, but he was the fifth vote to really decimate Roe v. Wade and to do Dobbs, because Chief Justice Roberts would have gone with a 14 or 16 week provision in the, I think it was Mississippi law. The fifth vote to really overturn Roe v. Wade and to do Dobbs turned out to be Kavanaugh. And then when that happened, remember Senator Collins, Republican woman from Maine, said, oh my goodness, I was bamboozled. I guess she's so easily fooled, isn't she, Mark? She's got a U.S. Senate seat for all these years, but she turns out to be so credulous. Hate when that happens, right? And boom, Kavanaugh went through. But the question that you're asking, and what Senator Whitehouse is finding, Mark, is that we were all BS'd by Trump and by the Republicans supporting Kavanaugh, that this was somehow a look everywhere. No, they were not told to look everywhere. Apparently, every tip, including how to handle this witness to the incident, this judge fellow, was carefully curated by the White House, and the FBI was told, don't really look anywhere. Just provide this report. And then the other shocking thing is that the senators supposedly only read this very long report for 1 hour. And you'd think that the Democratic senators would have screamed. I mean, this is why people get frustrated with the Democrats, because, you know, if the shoe had been on the other foot, you would have never heard the end of the Republicans screaming how little time they had, you know, with their 48, 49 votes. They would have screamed to high heaven, right, that they hadn't been given enough time with this report about Kavanaugh. Anyway, here we have Kavanaugh. If we don't increase the number of justices on the Supreme Court, you know, your younger listeners will have him deciding their fate for 30, 35 years.
Oh, exactly. He's a super consequential guy. FBI declines to comment on this report, and they issued a statement. The FBI follows a long-standing established process through which the scope of the investigation is limited to what is requested. And a White House said in an interview that the review of the FBI probe took him 6 years because of resistance from both the Trump and Biden administrations to providing correspondence with the FBI and access to FBI officials and answers to questions about the investigation. I mean, I think that's of note. Trump and Biden administrations. And until 2021, the only information Democratic senators said that they were able to obtain about the procedures for a supplemental background investigation was a publicly accessible YouTube video, David, explaining how the FBI tip line works. And in that video, there are assurances that everything is being done by the book, according to standard FBI procedures. Only there is no book and there is no procedure, said White House. So this idea it's being done by the book, there is no book.
Well, I think that the Democrats should have been very suspicious that it was not being done, with any thoroughness at all. And people were screaming at the time about this fellow judge. If you remember the story, like I said, I was on Laura Ingraham and a lot of other shows. And so I remember this all well because, you know, we got to the bottom of it. This fellow judge had decided apparently he didn't want to be a witness after all these years. Can you imagine? That made sense. And he went off to some reclusive place where he thought he wasn't going to get subpoenaed or no one was going to question him. And then I guess somebody went by, I think maybe an FBI agent went by and looked in the back of this car and saw mail that was addressed to this fellow judge. So they figured out, well, this guy must be nearby. And I think they found him at that point, despite his efforts not to be found. But they asked him something. And again, I don't remember every detail about it, but I think they asked him something like, do you know anything about it? And he said, no, not really. And that was the inquiry of the key witness. And of course, the Republicans controlled the Senate. They also controlled the House. But as to their control of the Senate, there was no way to bring that fellow judge in and question him. They did bring Dr. Ford in, and Dr. Ford was a very controversial witness. She came in from the Bay Area. She said she wasn't used to doing these kind of public appearances. She didn't want to have 20 cameras in her face because actually in the well of the Senate or House, when you see those people testify, it's a carnival. It's a circus, and there's cameras all pointing up at them and stuff like that. And if you're used to it, sure, you're the cabinet member. But if you're her, she said, I find this a very difficult environment. Can you please adjust the cameras? Can you have a little bit different, And I still remember Laura Ingraham rolling her eyes and going, she wants to set the conditions. And I said, Senator McConnell agreed to these conditions. Majority Leader McConnell agreed to these conditions. But she did testify. I thought it was very compelling testimony. And if people will remember, Kavanaugh then took the stand himself and had this angry, fiery exchange with a lot of the Democratic senators. And John Paul Stevens, one of my favorite justices, a Republican who was retired, said if he was qualified before, he certainly disqualified himself with that fiery, brusque appearance that he had. And you remember
that his temperament essentially was just not keeping. Right.
His temperament mark disqualified him. In addition to, but it was a Senator Klobuchar. He got into it with Senator Klobuchar, one or two of the others. And I think that presidential candidate now Harris, I think she was well known for her questioning. She had some questioning of Kavanaugh that was incisive, and is sort of one of the many things that show her ability, as a questioner, as an attorney, and as someone who's very talented and should be our next president.
We'll move on from this, but I did think one thing that was a revelation from all of this was I was always under the impression, because I just believed the published reports, that there was a tip line. I always felt that the FBI had ignored the tip line. The one thing that was revealed in the report was that there was no dedicated tip line set up for the Kavanaugh inquiry with the FBI. They said that there was, but there wasn't. Members of the public used a pre-existing portal called the National Threat Operations Center. The FBI got more than 4,500 calls and electronic messages related to Kavanaugh and was directed to forward the tips to the White House without pursuing any possible leads. This is all in the new report. Even when senators contacted the FBI directly with the names of people who claimed to have relevant information about Kavanaugh, the FBI did not contact them.
Well, Mark, people will remember, it was just so many. It was just one of the weird things that happened in the Trump administration. The New York Times compiled a list of 1,000. This was just one of the 1,000 weird, unprecedented things that happened during the Trump administration. But with Kavanaugh, you remember there was a second complainant who came forward about something that happened either in college or law school. And that looked like it was fairly credible and at least worth pursuing. People said that wasn't very much pursued. And then there was yet a third one. And that third person had an attorney like Michael Avenatti or somebody like that. And it was easy to ridicule that one. And so, of course, the defense of something, old lawyer's skill is take the weakest thing and act like that's the only thing they have against you. So the Republicans trumpeted that third claim against Kavanaugh, say all these weirdos are coming out of the woodwork. This Dr. Ford, by implication, just another weirdo making up stuff from the past. And they trained their fire on that third claim, and they tried to sort of make it look ridiculous, the whole thing. And then he squeaked right through. But if you get interested in this, Mark, it's really worth unearthing the testimony of Kavanaugh, that fiery session. And I don't remember the exact words, but he's screaming back and forth with Senator. He's screaming at Senator Klobuchar. You think, is this the way to get confirmed to anything, much less to be a United States Supreme Court justice? Screaming and yelling and just acting like you're kind of out of control. I mean, if someone had argued that way in front of him on the Supreme Court, they would have been probably hauled off for contempt.
Yeah, I mean, that's the point. And the point was meant at the time that it was a temperament that seemed not unfitting a member of SCOTUS. But that's how the fix is in, because he could do whatever he wanted. I mean, he could scream, bang the table, whatever he wanted. He was getting in to that vacant seat. And I'm so glad you mentioned that. Just to end on this, the shocking one was Senator Collins. I think that really history will know Senator Collins for only one thing: her misguided, supposedly credulous vote. She's directly responsible for Dobbs. She's directly responsible. A woman senator, for the Dobbs decision. And I mean, nobody should forget it. You could see very clearly that Kavanaugh, with his record and everything about him, was being promoted by these right-wing, anti-choice folks so that he could make exactly that decision.
And I don't know if she thought that somehow that was going to help her political survival up there. But I just really think, as little is known about senators, I think that's really all that the world will remember about Senator Collins, that she put Supreme Court justice, and she could have stopped him if she'd have announced that she wasn't going to vote for him. Because like I said, that's what Laura Ingraham was worried about. And with the election coming up, the idea was to pull him back, put in somebody. It would have been somebody more moderate, and figure it's better to get that person through than to have the Democrats take control of the Senate in a couple of months and not let anybody who wasn't like a middle of the road Merrick Garland type on the Supreme Court if the Democrats controlled the Senate, which they ended up, I'm trying to remember it right now. I think they ended up not winning the Senate, but maybe winning the House. Don't quote me on this.
Just noticing this, from Randy. If it wasn't Kavanaugh, this is wrong, Randy. David Katz just explained why it was wrong. Randy says, if it wasn't Kavanaugh, it would have just been another right-wing justice that got that nomination. No, David Katz just explained to you. They would have gone with a more moderate justice because they would want to get that confirmation through. So, I mean, perhaps events would have transpired the same way, but David's point is not necessarily. I mean, you get a more moderate justice in who would breeze through the nomination process and the confirmation process, and you might have had a different outcome, and Roe might still be a law on the books.
Susan Collins and Senator Lisa Murkowski, I think, would have put their foot down and should have put their foot down and just made it clear that someone like Kavanaugh was a bridge too far.
Randy owning it, saying, yeah, based on what Katz explained, my comment was wrong. I agree about Collins also, says a mountain bike fan. Yeah, the Collins thing is just anybody who, this idea, I looked him in the eyes and he looked me in the eyes and we met in my office, and that's just such a load of bunk always. God, I could tell he was, Marine to Marine. We looked at each other, or whatever it is. All that stuff is just garbage. All right, so moving. That's a significant thing. I want to mention one thing here that I do see in the chat, which is, what happens as a result of these things? These committees with people who have great power, and they expose these things that are super revelatory about the confirmation process and about the FBI and about how Trump controlled the investigation, et cetera. What are the effects of this and these revelations? Can you speak to that for a second?
Well, as part of my ruining people's day thinking about our Senate, Cannon, the notorious loose cannon down in Florida, she was like a last minute a nomination by Trump. And I think people thought, district court judge here, she seems kind of wacky, kind of inexperienced, but district court judge. She did not have a lot of Democratic opposition. Look through and see how many Democratic senators were either absent for the vote on Cannon or actually voted for Cannon. I think Feinstein. I think Feinstein might have voted for Cannon. The idea that, well, we're diversifying the federal bench and it's wonderful. Another woman's coming on the federal bench. Really? Cannon? How about this one Barrett on the U.S. Supreme Court? Really? I'm all for diversity, but come on, let's go with ideology and judicial philosophy first.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Feinstein hugged Lindsey Graham or whomever at the end of the isn't that right? At the end of that confirmation, it was just it was loathsome. Phineas asks, Mark, ask David Katz to talk about Trump giving Putin the COVID test machines and if that violated law. Can you speak to that, David Katz?
I love Stump the Cats. Usually it's Kim doing this to me, but this is great. This is why we have an interactive show. I don't think that he violated the law unless it was restricted. There are some restricted exports, and there's very clear rules about restrictive exports. But usually it's something of military significance, right? As some kind of computer defense technology. And I don't think that's what it was. And so I just don't think that there's any there as a violation of federal criminal law. But the fact that it was kept secret obviously shows that Trump knew he was doing something that the public would disapprove of. As Vice President Harris said the other day, I think it was was it on Colbert? It was on one of those shows that she did. She said, remember those days, how hard it was to get one of those kits. People were waiting in line for hours. There's a famous story of people who flew up to Alaska and pretended to be Native Americans. because they got a test kit of earlier than other people. This is the lengths that people went to get access to one of those kits, and to just give it when it was so scarce. It looks exactly the way it looks. It looks like this ridiculous favoritism toward a Russian dictator and murderer, and not to the American people. So I think that's why she's put it that way. But I think it's in the political sphere, Mark. I don't think it's some kind of federal criminal violation by Trump.
This from a Norm, who says Kavanaugh likes having Leonard Leo pay his debts. There is that thing about the fact that he had $200,000 worth of debt that sort of vanished, Brett Kavanaugh did, and we haven't really been able to figure out who paid that debt. That was another one of those, I thought, softball investigations. They never really did a hard look at that $200K and where it went.
As Justice Clarence Thomas would say, such small change. He took so little. He took so little. We don't know that Kavanaugh, it's not like someone canceled his marker or something like that. He is a huge baseball fan, by the way. But we don't know that somebody, forgave him a debt because he was.
We don't know it, but we don't see any evidence of him paying it.
Well, if they did, cancellation of debt is a taxable event. So if somebody says, you don't have to pay me back that $200,000 this year, you just made $200,000. A lot of people think that's kind of a tricky part of the tax code. But for people like Kavanaugh with good accountants, no, that's not tricky. If you have a $200,000 excused in a year, you've had $200,000 of income.
Yeah,
I'd come from regular stock.
The lady Beatrice asks, there have been calls to impeach SCOTUS. Can you review? We've talked about this before, but maybe you can just quickly. It doesn't take long. What would need to happen for an impeachment of a SCOTUS justice? Can you speak to that quickly?
The same way that you would impeach anyone else. So they'd have a majority in the House, which there's no majority in the House right now because it's Republican. But if you had just a bare majority, the bare majority could file articles of impeachment. The Republicans did that with a very bare majority against Alejandro Mayorkas. That was going to go nowhere, but they did it symbolically because he's head of the DHS and they don't like some of the policies. And while, everybody knows from civics class that you can't impeach an official over a policy disagreement, the Republicans in the House did it anyway, Mark, because they had a majority. The hard part, though, is to get the conviction in the Senate. Once the articles of impeachment are returned in the House, then the matter goes over to the Senate. Literally, you remember the managers of the impeachment from the House, they walk the articles of impeachment over. It was dramatic when Representative Schiff walked them over in one of the Trump impeachments. I remember that. And then you had the trial in the Senate. That's really up to whatever rules the Senate wants to impose. And then if after the trial, if 2/3 of the senators vote to convict, it's not a criminal conviction, but then the official, whether they be a Supreme Court justice or whether they be the president or someone like Mayorkas, is either convicted or cleared. Mayorkas was cleared. There was a summary proceeding. They said, this is ridiculous. Obviously, with Trump, it went to two really interesting trials both times. And both times there weren't 2/3 of the Senate. There weren't enough Republicans. So with Clarence Thomas, it would be the exact same procedure. It would set a terrible precedent, even if it were Thomas, to impeach a U.S. Supreme Court justice. That doesn't mean that if they thought it was warranted, they shouldn't do it. But they would never get, Mark, 2/3. I just cannot imagine.
That's the point. It's just not going to happen. Yeah, you just can't, the numbers just aren't there for the 2/3 that you need. And that's the problem with American government right now, that the gears have sort of ground to a halt. All right, I want to change from this world of the Kavanaugh revelations through Sheldon Whitehouse to something that is interesting, and those who are watching from all over, this is going to be something that's happening in an American city. It's happened in another American city, specifically San Francisco, but I think it's applicable, what's happening in many different municipalities and cities across the country, and it's the DA race in Los Angeles. So you have this guy, George Gascon, and he is being challenged, and he's being pitched by his challenger as too progressive, an ultra-lib, not tough enough on law and order, and that's the reason Los Angeles is having all of these problems. It's essentially barking the same way that that San Francisco recall did of Chesa Boudin. That's why I mentioned, and Gascon has experience in San Francisco as well, which might be relevant. But anyway, his opponent is Nathan Hochman. Can you speak to what's going on in Los Angeles and how you see this? It looks like Gascon may not win.
Well, first, to make full disclosure, I've known Nathan Hochman for years. He's somebody from the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Central District of California. That's this huge Los Angeles office that goes all the way out to the Nevada line, up to Santa Barbara, and down through Orange County. And so I'm going to know two very prominent politicians from the U.S. Attorney's Office, Adam Schiff, who I worked with, and Nathan Hochman. Nathan and I have kind of the same sort of practice, just again, to make full disclosure. We've even had cases. We had a case where a lawyer was being used by the federal government against several of his clients in a tax evasion case. If the lawyer is telling the story, he's telling it like I am, because Nathan, as smart and capable as he is, got a conviction, and I got a hung jury in the trial of my client. But we have very much the same kind of practice. A lot of time, Nathan's cases, the person alleged to have been a tax evader or some kind of a corporate thief. There's one more zero in the case. If I have the $10 million cases, he has the $100 million cases. But he's leaving a very successful law practice to run against Gascon, and he's way ahead in the polls. And it's kind of an interesting situation because he was in the George W. Bush administration. Hochman was. He was a law clerk for a judge who was appointed by Reagan. And so it's interesting that very liberal Los Angeles is on the verge of electing him. And I think that if they do, he'll start to be mentioned for things like governor. It will be a spectacular enough victory against a Democrat that I think that it would be very high numbers. You remember W, when he won in Texas, it was like, my goodness, this guy not only won the governorship down in Texas, but he won by 20 or 30 points. It'll be a big, big story. And so you wonder, how is this happening that the people in Los Angeles want to throw out a Democratic progressive prosecutor by a 30-point margin? And, Gascon has not been very wise in sort of some of his administrative decisions. And he got a lot of people upset in the office. Some people have sued him. Now, Mark, that's not as big a story as it would be in a lot of places because there's a very strong union among DAs. So they have huge job protection. So they can run against their boss, they can sue their boss, and there's a huge procedure to even oust the person from the office. Hochman says 200 people have left the DA's office because they don't want to work for Gascon. I find that very hard to believe. But anyway, turning back to Gascon, he's a fascinating figure because along with this fellow in San Francisco and a few others back east, he's one of those progressive prosecutors that were very in vogue 4 years ago when he ran, and that's about when the San Francisco DA, this is, in the aftermath, or I think it's about in the aftermath of, George Floyd being murdered by a police officer, and the country seeing that over and over again. Gascon won in large part because his predecessor, who was African-American woman, wouldn't prosecute cops. It just seemed that whatever the cop had done, they wouldn't prosecute the cop in the DA's office. And Gascon said that he would change that. And Gascon has indeed prosecuted a lot of police officers, sometimes with mixed results. But his point is that they were righteous cases. They should be brought. He's convicted some. He's had judges throw out others, but he's held cops' feet to the fire. And if you're worried about police misconduct, he says, I'm the guy. But one of his huge mistakes, Mark, was that political mistakes, was that there's a lot of feeling about whether to treat juveniles as adults, even if they've done some pretty heinous things. And, I'm sort of more from the school, like a lot of progressives are, that if somebody is a juvenile, you should try to keep them in juvenile court, but you shouldn't be inflexible. And California and all these counties have a system. And the one that really got Gascon in political trouble a couple of years ago was there's someone who's like 17 and 10 months. I'm not exactly right on that, but it's very close to 18. 18, he's an adult. 17 and 10 months could go either way. Gascon has a policy, which Hochman says is inflexible. Gascon has a policy that if you're under 18, you're going to be treated as a juvenile. And this person was treated as a juvenile after what I think it was a horrible incident. I think it was a murder. And to compound things, the thing doesn't really come up for decision for like 3 or 4 years. So now the person is like 21 or 22. There's this horrible murder or incident when the person was almost 18 and they're treated as a juvenile. And that got massive publicity. And certainly from then on, he has been the piñata in the right-wing media. And, you know, you can get this drum. It's like the New York Post. They can drum just about anybody out of office because day after day, they take what they claim is the worst thing that they've done. And, you know, if there's two guys fighting, there's a big picture of the fighting and, you know, New York City out of control. And they've kind of done that in LA. And the perception is that there's a huge amount of crime. That's not backed up by the statistics. Now, what Hochman says is that you have done such a bad job, Gascon. LA has been Gasconed, he said. Clever term. LA has been Gasconed to such an extent that now the police won't even arrest people for some offenses, and they won't even bother to present them to the DA's office. So you've got a phony decrease in crime. I don't know. The statistics seem to show there's been a decrease in crime, but I don't think this race is close anymore, but it's fascinating. And, you know, this is the prosecutors who supposedly got or did get money from Soros. You know, Soros was trying to do, and there's reason we have over incarceration. This is what people were talking about 3 or 4 years ago, but now it really doesn't seem to have stuck very much, at least in LA. And let me say one more thing. Gascon is like, I think, thinking, how can this be happening to me? Maybe I'm not as articulate and glib as Hochman, but how can this be happening to me? I'm a former police officer, right? I'm somebody who's spent almost his whole life in law enforcement in one, way or another. And while Hochman has been an assistant U.S. attorney like me, and he was a high official in the George W. Bush administration, has basically been a private practice guy like me, representing what Gascon said during the debate the other night, the wealthy and tax evaders. And that's so, right. You know, your friend David Katz, that's my practice, the wealthy and tax evaders. And you have all the right in the world. If the wealthy and alleged tax evaders want to hire you, you know, it's not easy. Everybody in the world wants to get hired like Hochman and I do by these people who have interesting criminal cases and can afford to pay for their defense. So, you know, they threw a lot of accusations at each other, Mark. But I was just going to say the fellow up in San Francisco, I don't think had ever been a police officer. And
no, had not. No.
Yeah.
No.
He was not at all. Gascon, like I said, is like, how can this be happening to a Democrat and a former police officer in Democratic LA County? But it's happening.
Yeah. Kim, go ahead.
Fun fact about George Gascon. I don't know if people in Southern California know that he was not only the police chief in the city of San Francisco, but he was the San Francisco district attorney before he moved to Southern California.
Yeah.
Like I said, he's saying, how can I be behind by 25 points in Democratic Los Angeles?
I mean, you know, and then you have Hochman saying in the debate the other night, look, violent crimes, property crimes, hate crimes, human trafficking up double digits since Gascon took office. Fear is up because crime is up. And then, you know, Gascon says these numbers are just wrong. I mean, it's just a lie, you know. And then the mass incarceration to which you've referred, David, that was a big part of what Gascon was trying to fight. But I think you so correctly identify something, and I think this applies to the national political discourse, which is once the media gets something going, it's pretty hard to stop that momentum. And that contagion spreads from, in the case of the LA Times in Los Angeles, it goes to all of the newspapers in Los Angeles or in Southern California. It goes to all the digital outlets. It goes to TikTok. It goes to Instagram. It becomes a jihad almost. And it's very hard to turn that around.
Well, I've been on with Trace Gallagher. He reports nationwide on Fox, but he reports from Los Angeles. Terrific guy, very talented. But, you know, he's on this bandwagon. And so when something happens here, it gets this coverage, which is very anti-Gascon. And as I said, he's made some of his own problems. Let me give you an example. There's a lot of gang enhancements. So let's say you're a 19-year-old and you're involved in a robbery with your crew. And it looks like your crew is gang affiliated or is a gang. And let's say for the robbery, you get convicted and you get 10 years in prison. And then there's a gang enhancement. Let's say it's 5 years. He's generally not sought the gang enhancement. I think now he is seeking some more gang enhancements. So you can argue in the right-wing media, or Hochman can argue, this is terrible. If you're in a gang, you should be punished for being in a gang. I get it. But, you know, 19-year-old, it's a robbery. You know, no one's killed, no one's injured, but it's a robbery. To me, that's enough time. To me, that's enough time. You got your 10 years. By now, you're late 20s when you get out. You hopefully have been rehabilitated. You've done some things to show that you're rehabilitated. You get a second chance in life. Should you have to wait 5 more years because you also got hit with a gang enhancement? I think Gascon is on the right track with this, but it's easy to get the victim, right? And they get the victim on TV and the victim is crying and they're saying, Gascon, he didn't even ask for a gang enhancement and this guy was in a gang. I mean, if you want to do something about over-incarceration, if you want to do something about the fact that people of color get hit extremely hard in our system, if you want to do something about that, I think Gascon was trying to do something about it. But as Hochman said, George, pack your bags.
Yeah, it doesn't look good for Gascon. Hey, listen, in our next visit, I'd like to get to the election and the ways in which, because there's several ways, the ways in which SCOTUS can become involved in the election and the election outcome. I'm talking about the election for president in the United States and the system by which the people's voice is parked or is not heard, ultimately is executed, because SCOTUS is a big part of it. I mean, I think they did it in a crude way in Florida, in Bush v. Gore, but there are all kinds of ways they could do it again in the Trump-Harris election. And I really want to get to that next week, because I think it's a little more of a long conversation, and we only, we kind of have taken a lot of time already, so we kind of have to wrap up. But are you good with that? Can we get into that next time?
I'm fine with that. Let me leave you with these words. I do agree with one thing that Trump says on the stump: too big to rig. So Harris needs to win, too big to rig. If she wins these swing states by a large vote, all of these efforts come to naught. Even this crazy pro-Trump election commission down there, the ones that he called out and praised from the stump down there in Georgia. If the vote's coming in and, Harris is winning by 5%, it's over. There's no attempt to try to rig it. One of the reasons why we had all of these things, remember in Trump's other famous words, just find me 11,000 votes. Just concoct, he meant 11,000 votes. When elections that close, 11,000 votes. And everybody makes a difference, our voice here, Mark, that goes out to people, it makes a difference. Everything that happens, if people have their friends, if you're in California, drive into Arizona, drive into Nevada. If you can do it, pick people up and take them to the polls. I did that for Kerry, and I was shocked. I figured, the Democratic machine does that. No, there were people waiting and had no way to get to the polls. I put them in my big old car, and I spent the whole day driving them to the polls. I myself, in that very retail fashion, made a difference in the vote in Nevada. Kerry lost by a point, and losing Nevada, he also lost a W. But you can really make a difference, and everyone should make a difference. Help Harris win in a way that's too big to rig, too big to play games. But yes, let's talk about what they're going to try to do to play games.
Yeah, that'd be great. And I just have to say, David, though, just a cold slap in the face. I mean, it really looks as though, based on all polling, that we could be down to another 11,780 situation. I mean, it's a very tight race. I don't know if you can win this race too big to fix, too big to rig.
I'm not sure how good the polling is, and if people are motivated. I've always believed this since Trump came down the escalator. I've always believed this phony, this mountebank, even if you agree with the message, this is the wrong messenger. He claimed to do something about China, and then as soon as his daughter got a bunch of patents approved by China, he'd sell you down the river, you workers who are voting for him, thinking he's going to bring back the economy from China. So I've always underestimated. I guess David K. Johnson and I have that in common, Mark. We've always underestimated how people can vote for this guy, and I'm underestimating it again. And I think that Harris is going to win, but people have to really help. But we'll talk about what they're going to try to do. What the Republicans are trying to do, what they're already trying to do. I think the Supreme Court is not going to help him on this one. I don't think they're going to put their finger on the scale. Alito and Thomas, but I don't think that the rest are going to really. They didn't help him in 2020 when he was the incumbent. The same crew.
Yeah, it's a little harder because he's not the incumbent, but this is for next week. We'll back burner until then. Great. David Katz, appreciate it so much. The great David Katz, everybody. Hi, it's Mark, and I thought that was great. Hit the notification bell. You'll know whenever there's a new video being dropped, and please subscribe to our channel. to help us save the universe.